The modern Olympics stand as one of the pinnacles of top sporting events in the world. Here, athletes from around the world compete in the ultimate tournament where, for many of them, they are able to achieve levels of fame, prestige, and recognition often preserved for professional athletes. The majority of the competitors are amateurs, meaning they do not make their full living playing their sport, and the Olympics represent the highest level of competition and the greatest symbol of greatness for their sport. So large have the Olympics become that they are split into two different competitions, the Summer and Winter Games, to be able to have all the competitions play out. Each version of the Games occurs every 4 years, giving their rarity a greater air of importance. Yet how did this sporting competition originate? What was the point of creating the competition? In this talk, I'll give you a brief history of the origins of the modern Olympics. The modern Olympic movement is 128 years old, having been founded in 1894, though the first Games were not held until 1896. The origin of the Olympics can be placed on the work of one man, French educator and somewhat athlete of Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Coubertin was born in 1863 in Paris to an aristocratic French family, which gave him a high level of education and opportunities to connect with the elites of French society. As a child, he witnessed a seminal moment in French history with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. The rapid defeat of the French army at the hands of the Germans in the war left a scar on French society, particularly the right-wing elites of society who were heavily prominent in the military. The chaos in France with the capture of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte III and his removal from power led to Coubertin witnessing violence and strife in Paris as the Paris Commune and the Third Republic were established. Tensions in French society in the early years of the new republic, as well as the shame of defeat to the Germans, left many in France soul-searching for reasons why their nation had failed so spectacularly and how to rebuild. Coubertin, raised in a conservative Catholic household and attending a Catholic school, became interested in trying to solve these issues as he started a career as an educator. Coubertin found an answer to many of the pressing issues in France when he traveled to England in 1883. There he met with famed English schoolmaster Thomas Arnold, who was the head of Rugby School, an elite public school in England and the place where the sport of rugby was, quote, invented. Arnold was a proponent and one of the key developers of the idea of muscular Christianity, an idea that advocated for students and youths to play sports as a means to develop their physical strength, but more importantly, for them to learn lessons about how to live a moral life and develop character. Arnold and other British educators had advanced muscular Christianity in response to the Industrial Revolution that they believed was creating weakness with the new technology and to counter the belief that the weakness was creating selfish, spoiled, and unprepared students for the real world. Coubertin found that Arnold and the ideas of muscular Christianity were answers to the questions being asked in France. Coubertin returned to France and began advocating for French schools to copy the British model and introduce sports. Coubertin was not alone in pushing sports in France. Others saw the benefits of advocating for sports as a way to improve the physical prowess of French citizens, and military officials also pushed more sports. The final decades of the 19th century saw the widespread growth of English sports across France as football and rugby, two of the largest sports in France today, became popular during this time. Coubertin constantly advocated for the development of sport in France. Coubertin came up with the idea for an international sporting competition at some point in 1889 or 1890. The idea of reviving the Olympics was not new, and most likely Coubertin was influenced by the work of others who had been working to revitalize ancient Olympic-style sporting events. One major influence was Dr. William Brooks, a British physician who had made several attempts to start an Olympic movement in Britain. When Brooks learned about Coubertin's interest, he became involved and the two corresponded until Brooks's death in 1895. Brooks played an important role in helping Coubertin come up with the Olympics as he had experienced in the pitfalls and trials of organizing an international sporting competition. Two others who played an influential role were the Greek businessmen and cousins Evangelos and Konstantinos Zabas. Both men were fierce Greek nationalists, and they used their wealth to advocate for Greek culture. They supported the development of Olympic-style games and organizations around Greece by funding the events and building stadiums. Most famously, they restored the Panathinaik Stadium in Athens that had originally been built around 330 BC. Brooks and the Zappas saw sports and their Olympic movements as helping to advance the physical health of their nations. The Zappas went further in seeing the Olympics as developing strong nationalist identity to defend Greece. Coubertin, though, was not a militarist, and rather than seeing sports as a way to build up France's armies, he saw it as a bridge to encourage peace. Coubertin saw sports as a means for athletes, nations, and people to interact in environments that encouraged dialogue and competition that did not result in deaths, making it easier for them to see the shared humanity between them. For Coubertin, international sports competitions were a way for cooperation rather than strife. It was this element that stood out for Coubertin's Olympic movement from the others that had come before. Coubertin worked for years on developing this philosophy for what sports was meant to be, and it was in the Olympic movement that he combined his thoughts on sports, education, character, and politics to create the Olympic Charter. In 1894, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, was created during an international conference in Paris. Coubertin had brought an international group of different heads of sports organizations together to discuss the idea of the Olympics to them. Coubertin found many allies around the world who agreed with his ideas, and they began working to put them into practice. Part of Coubertin's success was his ability to network, and here his aristocratic background worked to his advantage. Coubertin was able to communicate with many of Europe's and the world's elites as they operated in the highest social circles. These elites helped run the major sporting organizations that oversaw individual sports, such as gymnastics, athletics, and others. Using his connections, Coubertin was able to enlist the support of British, French, German, Austrian, Greek, and American elites to form the IOC and support his movement. The first IOC members were a boys' club of aristocrats, the elites of their nations. As such, Coubertin advocated for a narrower version of the Olympic movement, believing that only amateurs should be allowed to compete, no prize money was to be given to winners, and that only men should be allowed to compete. Criticism of the IOC and the Olympics in general being elitist are well-founded, as the Olympics from the very beginning were designed to represent the elites of European societies. Coubertin was very resistant to any addition of women to the Olympics, and no female athletes were allowed to compete in the first Games. The first Olympic Games were held in Athens in 1896. As Greece was the origin for the Olympics from ancient times, many members felt it was right that the first games would be held in Greece. Headed by the Greek government and sports organizations, the Olympics were seen as a success as the public and participants praised the event. Coubertin's dream had become a reality, but the Olympic movement was by no means secure. The Games in Greece were so popular, many advocated that all Olympic Games be hosted by Greece, something the Greek government, public, and sports organizers agreed with. Coubertin resisted, though, believing that if the Olympics were to be a true international competition, it needed to cycle around the globe. The next games in 1900 were in Coubertin's home of Paris, but suffered from political squabbling and competition. Due to continued resentment in France to the Germans, many French sports personalities argued that German athletes should be banned. Coubertin and the IOC were able to overrule their jingoism, but the rumors that France was advocating this reached German athletes who responded with outrage. It was only through Coubertin's letters to Kaiser Wilhelm II that the German public and athletes were calmed down. During the same time of the Olympics, Paris was hosting the World's Fair, an event that Coubertin and the IOC hoped would attract more people to the Games and garner more press coverage, but instead it caused problems. The organizers of the fair were resistant to the IOC and Coubertin's interference, and they quarreled frequently. The Games saw far less attention than the IOC had hoped for. In 1904, the Olympics traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to St. Louis, USA, to fulfill their global mission. The Games in St. Louis proved to be more difficult than the Paris Games. Again, the World's Fair was in St. Louis that year, and it overshadowed the Games. The dominance of Europe in the Games was starkly revealed as the St. Louis Games saw a low number of athletes participate due to the difficulty of traveling. The Americans also used the opportunity to fill the competition with as many of their own athletes as possible, turning the 1904 Games into an American competition with some foreign athletes. Due to the poor showing in the 1900 Olympics, later confirmed by the 1904 Olympics, the IOC decided to allow Greece to host events in between official Olympic Games, with the first to be held in 1906. The 1906 Games, while not an official Olympic event, it was held in Athens and proved to be hugely successful in their implementation, partially due to Greek officials with experience, but also due to the shorter time span. Instead of hosting the Games over months, they were done in only 10 days. The shorter nature of the Games saw them receive more attention as the competitions were packed together and allowed for a constant media presence over the 10 days. The Games were seen to be even more successful than the 1896 Games. It was in 1906 that athletes were paraded into the event behind their national flags as part of an opening ceremony. Unfortunately for the Greeks, the policy of hosting games between official events was cancelled by the IOC, and no Olympic Games would be hosted in Greece until 2004. The next official Games of 1908 were seen in comparison as weak and chaotic to the 1906 Games. Originally planned to be hosted in Rome, the Games were moved to London, England due to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1906, and funds for the Games were diverted to rebuild Naples by the Italian government. The Olympics in 1908, though, were long, lasting over 6 months. Part of this was due to the introduction of the first winter sport, figure skating, that had to be held later in the year for the ice to be made. Due to the length of the Olympics, the decision was made to cut winter sports and restrict all competitions to only a 2-week period to replicate the success of the 1906 Games. As well, the IOC introduced the need for international judges and officials in the Games after several controversies erupted surrounding British judges in the 1908 Games. The 1912 Games saw Coubertin and the IOC call for greater focus and attention on the athletics. The restriction of the Games to be held in a shorter time span and at lesser cost were advocated by the IOC to try and keep the Games relevant and engaging. Hosted by Stockholm, Sweden, the Games of 1912 proved to be more successful than their previous versions. The Games were well received by the public and the competitions were seen as successes. The Games saw the first Asian nation participate, as Japan sent a handful of athletes. The Games tried to expand with artistic competitions for literature, poetry, architecture, and painting, where medals were awarded. Coubertin won the gold medal for poetry as he submitted a poem under a pseudonym. Coubertin had advocated for these artistic competitions to better meet the spirit of the Olympic movement that fostered the best of humanity and cooperation. Other IOC members disagreed, and while future Olympics did have artistic displays, they never again were awarded medals like the athletes. The outbreak of the First World War, rather than breaking the Olympic movement, instead functioned as a moment of rebirth for the IOC. The next Games, scheduled for 1916, were planned to be hosted by Berlin, but when war broke out, it was not clear that it would proceed. The Germans tried to reassure the IOC that they could host the Games, but with so many nations of Europe at war with Germany, and the number of athletes in uniform, the IOC chose to cancel the Olympics. The plan for the 1920 Games had been to award them to Antwerp, Belgium, but due to the war and the city falling under German occupation, it was not clear they would be able to host the Olympics. When the armistice was signed in 1918, the IOC put all their efforts to ensure Antwerp would be ready to host the Games. As Belgium underwent reconstruction, rapid work was undertaken to prepare the city for the Games. The 1920 Games were much smaller than previous Games due to financial difficulties for the athletes to travel, as well as bans by Belgium on the defeated nations of Germany, Austria, Turkey, and Bulgaria, who were not allowed to participate. Russia, now the Soviet Union, rejected the IOC and refused to participate in any Olympics until the 1950s. Nevertheless, the Olympics in Antwerp were seen as a success by Coubertin, and the IOC used the event to act as a symbolic rebirth for peace, internationalism, and the Olympic movement out of the war. It was in the 1920 Games that two key elements of the modern Olympics were first introduced: the oath and the flag. Both had been created by Coubertin in the years before the First World War, and they had been worked on by the IOC to be introduced at some point. The oath was inspired by the ancient oaths athletes took before the statue of Zeus, and Coubertin wanted the oath to be used to reinforce the ideas of fair play, peace, and unity in sports. The Olympic flag had been created in 1914 and was planned to be released in the 1916 Games. The flag, still used today, features 5 interlocked rings representing the 5 habitable continents of the globe: the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. Each a different color to represent the 5 most common colors on national flags. During the opening ceremony, the flag was raised for the first time to symbolize the unity of the international community. The oaths were taken, and doves were released to symbolize peace. Each of these have been used in successive Olympics to emphasize the peaceful, cooperative, and unifying nature of the Olympic movement. In 1924, the Olympics returned to Paris, but for the first time hosted a separate winter event. Figure skating returned and ice hockey was introduced in 1920 to be played months after the games finished. The IOC chose to create a separate timeline for winter events that would be played in the same year in the host nation. With Paris hosting the Summer Games in 1924, the Winter Games were played in Chamonix in southern France. Hosts had to be able to have both Summer and Winter Games played in their nation, resulting in countries instead of cities being selected. This remained until 1992, when the two were separated, and the current setup has been used ever since. These games also marked the end of Coubertin's time in charge of the IOC. Having served as president since 1896 and as the leading figure in the organization, he retired in 1925. Coubertin, though, remained active in the Olympics even after his retirement, coming out as an active supporter for Germany to host the 1936 Olympics. Coubertin passed away in 1937 of a heart attack in Switzerland. The Olympic movement, though, was firmly entrenched by the time he departed, allowing it to survive the cancellation of 2 games due to the Second World War in 1940 and 1944. The games would experience increased interest and declines over the decades, but by the 1920s, it has succeeded in establishing itself as the elite sporting competition in the world. Below are listed a series of sources that can provide more information about the history of the Olympics, particularly more details about the early games during the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries.